Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Linn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV9.
Good day and welcome to Ethical Perspectives on the News. I'm Heather Hayes, pastor at First Presbyterian Church in Cedar Rapids, and I will be the moderator for today's program. Issues of immigration in Iowa are not a new thing. Back in the 90s, living on the west side of the state, it was fairly commonplace to hear of small-scale raids and deportations from the beef and pork processing plants. In eastern Iowa, all you have to say is the word Postville, and all thoughts go to the raids that occurred up there 10 years ago, where the town was leaving the town less a quarter of its residents. With the election of President Trump and the resultant focus on shutting down borders and deporting the undocumented, issues of who is welcome within our borders have again taken the national stage, with heated opinions on both sides. Today we are going to be looking at this issue from an Iowan point of view. Here in Cedar Rapids, there has been a recent influx of refugees from African countries, either directly or as secondary moves from where they entered the country. In other communities, we'll find pockets of immigrants or refugees from Central and South America. In all cases, Iowan communities, especially rural ones, are seeking to navigate this path from being a place where people have lived for generations to a place where people are coming to make a new life. To help me explore this issue, I have with me on today's panel John Derryberry, Executive Director of Family Promise of Linn County. Welcome, John.
Thanks for having me.
Welcome. And Reverend Trey Hegar from First Presbyterian in Mount Pleasant, the pastor there. Welcome, Trey. Thanks for coming up to Cedar Rapids today.
Thanks for having me, Heather.
So now neither of you have a particular background working with immigrant populations. Trey, you're trained as a Presbyterian pastor, and John, you come to the table with a background in social work. Most especially working with teens. So why don't we start for a moment talking about how you have found yourself intersecting with issues of immigration in Iowa. John, do you want to go first?
Sure. I recently took a position at Family Promise as the executive director, and we are a homeless shelter. And Catherine McCauley Center called and said they had a refugee family that was homeless. They asked if we had a spot. We did, and now I'm in the deep end of a lot of refugee issues and immigration issues for this family and getting them through the immigration system, getting them reunited as a family and figuring things out as I go. So I'm learning something new every day.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And Trey, would you like to?
Sure. So in my congregation that I'm currently serving, some years back during the Vietnam War, when families were coming over from Vietnam and Laos, Cambodia, the boat people, the families in the congregation, several of them opened up their homes to refugees. So in 2015, when the refugee crisis was going on in Syria, and there was that picture of the 3-year-old boy face down on the Mediterranean seashore, they said, well, it's time for us to do something again. And so they formed a commission through the church to help refugees and immigrants. And we quickly found out that the placement system for refugees and immigrants changed so that it's not just raise your hand and family will show up at your door. So with that, our mission changed to reaching out and making inroads to the immigrant community already present in Mount Pleasant. So we started doing things like international potlucks and doing some awareness things, renting out the movie theater and showing a documentary there about why all of a sudden since 2014 has there been a mass migration from El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, and basically learning and reaching out to across the state. So we had started doing that as just education and neighborliness. When the raid happened in Mount Pleasant on May 9th, there was an ICE raid on the concrete plant in Mount Pleasant, and we had 32 men from our community detained. And because our church had already welcomed and hosted families from immigrants or immigrant families and leadership across the board from the state, everyone just came and met at the church. We made some phone calls to other leaders and advocates across the state, and lawyers from the University of Iowa showed up, folks from Catholic Charities, folks from the Methodist, JFON, Justice for Our Neighbors, who have some immigration lawyers, as well as some of the Hispanic leadership from LULAC and other organizations all came and met at the church with the families to talk about next steps. And then the next day we had the police chief and the mayor and a state representative there to talk about what had happened. And suddenly we just found ourselves in the middle of the immigration conversation. We had put ourselves there and made some preparations to be that. We never expected it to happen in Mount Pleasant.
Well, thank you for sharing that little bit of your stories. I would like to talk a little bit now, if you're able, about some of the journeys taken by some of the people that you are working with. One of the tendencies, I think, in conversations surrounding immigration or refugees is that oftentimes they are seen or talked about as, kind of this homogenous block of individuals. And so I'm hoping you'll be comfortable sharing some of your different experiences of the families that you've had an opportunity to work with, and tell a little bit about their stories, where they've come from, what their hopes are, and some of the experiences and the ways in which they've been trying to navigate their way into citizenship in our country. Jump right in, either one of you.
So I've had a very unique experience because of the diverse groups of families that we've been working with. 22 of the men who were detained in the ICE raid were from Guatemala. 1 was from El Salvador, and 7 were from Mexico. The families are all different in their backgrounds and in their process towards becoming a naturalized citizen in the United States. So, for example, one man who was detained had been in the United States for 14 years. He'd come on a work visa, and he had had his visa renewed every time until just a couple of years ago. Well, one of the only ways to become a U.S. citizen, and I've learned there's only 3 ways to become a U.S. citizen, is by establishing a permanent residence. That's how you become a U.S. citizen. So you have to be here to do that on a work visa, which he was doing, and he paid taxes. We took all of his tax documents to the lawyer when we were going to post bond for him. So he paid taxes. He owns his home. His daughter was born here, and so she's a U.S. citizen. He has another daughter that came when she was about 3, and so she's on DACA. And then the other, just to go back, the only other way to become a U.S. citizen then is if you're married or if you're born here. So you can either work here, establish permanent residence, marry a U.S. citizen, or be born here. And so he was working for all those years to become a U.S. citizen, bought his home, paid his taxes, worked his job, and all of a sudden his visa wasn't renewed. Well, he decided that he was going to overstay his visa, and then he was taken in the raid. So that's one story. Another story is about a father whose son at the age of 10 was starting to be used as a drug mule in Guatemala. And so he snuck his son across Central America underneath trains, crossing deserts, and brought him to the only place in America where they knew anybody, which just happened to be Mount Pleasant, Iowa, because there were already some families from Guatemala there, and they knew of that. So they came here. His dad got deported, and now his son is here at the age of 15 by himself, no other family, and he's living with a church family now. So very different stories. There's another story of a man who married a U.S. citizen, and they've been married for 15 years, and he is still, to this day, working on becoming a citizen. It's complicated. It takes a long time, and people think, well, I can just marry someone. There's that Sandra Bullock movie, and she's Canadian, and she's going to get deported. Right, and so she gets married, and everything's
fine. And then everybody's, woohoo, you're here.
No, no. What they don't see is that it costs $45,000, and 15 years later, perhaps you may get your citizenship, but then they'll go in and they'll find the paperwork just wasn't filled out correctly, and so the whole process is just done over. So each family, each situation is very unique. And so one of the things I learned is that over 50% of the people who are in the United States undocumented have overstayed a visa. So the myth of they're swimming across rivers and that they're coming across barbed wire fences and things like that. It's not true.
Okay. Well, John, do you want to hop in with your?
I think that what I would like to kind of highlight is the decisions that these families have to make. Our family is from Congo and Angola, and there was some violence occurring in, and some of it directly towards them for their religious beliefs, and that they had to make a decision about safety. And I think as we talk about all the differences where we come from different countries and how we interact and we bridge these gaps, I think every parent at their core would realize how difficult it is when you're trying to make a decision about your child's safety. And if you look at it through that lens, this family felt this was, the United States of America was the only opportunity to do this. And there is this myth that a lot of people come over and they're hiding and they're doing these things. Our family came over. They were picked up by ICE. They immediately identified themselves and said, yes, we're not here legally. We'd like to apply for asylum. And then they've been in the system since then. And they followed every rule possible and checked in with ICE and has built a relationship with the government agencies that they need to build those relationships with. But it's still such a long process. But that journey to get here, as I've gotten to know the family more, and they tell me about, going through the jungles of Panama and being separated from their daughter and having, bullets fired at them. I don't think that we put that journey in the right perspective, that they are willing to risk everything to get to the United States of America. So what is going on in the United States of America that is not occurring in other countries that people say, like, I got to get there? And I think that's something that we kind of forget as we look at them and we have our differences and they speak different languages and it's tough for them to fit into our society and our customs, that we kind of forget that was a very big decision in their life. And being a new parent myself, I would do the same thing. If America was unsafe and I needed to go to another country, I'd pack my wife and kid up and go and deal with the consequences when I got there, because they're not making these decisions of like, oh, I want to go take John's job. It's, I just want to make sure my kid can wake up and not get shot at. And I think that's something that doesn't get talked about enough in these families' journeys and their stories about who they are and why they're coming here.
There was a great poem and it said, you don't jump into shark-infested waters unless the ship you're on is on fire.
Yeah.
And then you leave. And that's what a lot of these families are choosing, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing some of those stories. So this is a learning journey for all of you, for both of you. What are some of the things that you are continuing to learn about the challenges that individuals and families face as they come to the United States, and how does differences in culture and language play a part of that?
Well, I think you hit probably the nail on the head, especially with this administration, and whether you're for or against this administration, they have changed some of the rules on immigration. And they are, as they're trying to update the immigration laws and the asylum laws and everything to what they feel they should be, there are changes that are happening that we don't learn about until like it's in a newspaper article. And so then we're scrambling to figure out how to help this family. So Cedar Rapids is really set up pretty well to help refugee families. Waypoint and Willis Dady have programs that will help them to get housing, but recently there are some proposals to change that if a family seeking asylum receives government funding, they will be charged as a public charge, and that way they're on the government's funding stream, and that's supposed to be used for citizens, and so then they're deported. And that rule just went into effect and possibly may go into effect in February. It's partially in effect in August. How is a refugee family supposed to get that information if they don't have representation, if they're not getting documents in their own language? And so navigating those changes when our administration is making these big changes across the board, right or wrong, good or bad, it's difficult for the nonprofit agencies that are designed to help to stay up to date on these things, and it's difficult for these families to navigate that system when they're trying to do everything correctly, but a rule changes, and you
in
don't.
The middle of a very long process.
Of a very, very long process, and so that's the biggest thing that I've learned through this process is when you think you have something done, you probably don't have it done. And you go back to the drawing board, and meanwhile, this family is like, you know, how do we move forward? How do we get a house? How do we work? How do we give back to, you know, you guys, because you're helping us? And it's like, well, you got to wait because this changed or this happened or this happened. And so it's got to be super frustrating for them because, you know, it's super frustrating for me.
So for me, one of the things that I find that, or have heard from the families that they find frustrating, is that the rhetoric that we hear from our leaders. So, for example, they're criminals, they're rapists, they're murderers, and these are the ones who are coming. Well, 24 of the men who were detained have been bonded out because the court had records of them establishing permanent records, or establishing permanent residence, working the process the right way, with no felonies, no speeding tickets, no warrants, no domestic abuse, had paid taxes, their payroll taxes all submitted. They're doing the right things. It's a really long process, and for those folks, the judge said, you are upstanding people. You can stay here until your immigration hearing to decide, can you continue on the path for citizenship, establishing your permanent residence, or are we going to deport you? And then the conundrum here is that during that time, so the earliest court date or immigration hearing is February of 2019. The next one is September 2019. So they've been detained. They've lost their work permit, they don't have a new one, and so they can't work until that immigration hearing or until they get a new work permit. We decided to help during that time to kind of fill that gap. But then we had another family member come to us and say, I want to self-deport. I'm gonna go ahead and just go back to Mexico. And the judge said, no. You can't. You have to stay until your immigration hearing or you lose your $10,000 bond. And so now there's someone who wants to self-deport, and the court has said, no, you can't self-deport. They're not a criminal. They're not a rapist. They're not wanting to have this on the record because they have family here. They want to come back to see, and they want to go back and get their visa renewed and come back and do the process over again. But in the meantime, they have to stay here until February and not work. And that to them is very hard. So I think part of it is they don't live into the truth of the, back that up. So they're not criminals, rapists, and abusers. One's a little league soccer coach. They were all taken at work. They're family people. One goes to my son's elementary school. And the other side is the administrative side of it is so backwards and messed up that it's nearly impossible to navigate. And you know, we're talking about people who are helping them who have upper graduate degrees, postgraduate degrees, and we can't figure it out, right? And everything's in English, you know. So for these families, it's even harder to do.
Well, then that sort of leads me into my next question. What have you seen in terms, I guess, and it's a pair of questions. On the one hand, how do you see communities' resources kind of being stretched by trying to kind of deal with and navigate these issues? But then how do you see communities being enriched by the presence of diverse cultures within them?
So,
and maybe that's more for you because you're seeing it from a community perspective that you might be able to
we're
jump
serving
into.
a whole community. So for us, we had a lot of the items, all of the money that we're using to help with rent and utilities and those things were donated. A lot of it donated from across the state of Iowa, not just from the community of Mount Pleasant. A lot of it donated from across the country, and the families have come in, and for example, for the food pantry, it's run by two daughters of men who worked at the concrete plant. And so they organized it. They developed a point system so each family can come in. You can get one loaf of bread. That's 1 point. You can get a bottle of detergent. That's 2 points. You get 10 points a week. You can come once a week, and you get your points. And they organized it. I just talked to the director of the Fellowship Cup, which is our big giving center in Mount Pleasant, and I said, "Have you felt an effect from people donating to us? Have you felt a loss on your side?" He said, in no way, shape, or form. They showed up today to give us bread for our families. So he said, we have not been in any way, shape, or form stretched by those needs. And then in part of them giving back to the community, we had a need. There was a lady moving from Oskaloosa to Mount Pleasant, and she's somewhat physically disabled and was moving to a second story apartment building. And it was our immigrant families that showed up to help carry some of the furniture and things like that up the stairs. So, because they want to give back, and anything they could do to give back, they're excited to do.
Well, and then I've heard you also speaking about, they're little league soccer coaches. They're
Yes.
helping in the school.
Yeah.
They're part of the community in full.
Yeah. So when you go to a concrete factory and you take someone who's been a manager and he's a little league soccer coach, and your official charter is to go get criminals, I think you've overstepped your bounds.
I would say with the family that I'm interacting with, they're almost more upset that they can't be more a part of the community. Like they've wanted to dive in, and we've had to hold back on what they're allowed to do and not allowed to do. And then the other thing is we're extremely volunteer based, and so our family is interacting with numerous faith communities across the Cedar Rapids, Marion area, and all the volunteers have fallen in love with this family because they're just such a caring, loving family, and a number of the volunteers have said, like, man, they have been through the ringer and they're fun. And the girls are, they play and they take care of the little brother and this little kid who I'm trying to teach him how to say my name first just because I'm selfish like that. But like he's starting to interact, and the mom and dad, and so they get to be a family, and then our community at Family Promise gets to see this family who has went through the ringer and respond with such resiliency. And then, they've kind of went back and been like this is like, we should be helping more and we should be doing more things, because if these are the people that want to come to Iowa and be a part of our community, like they want to hang out with them. They love hanging out with them. And so I think that our community has responded overwhelmingly positive to this family and wanting to know how they can help them. And that goes to the other area nonprofits that I've been in contact with as we figure this out, from Catherine McCauley to Willis Dady to Waypoint, and figure out how Cedar Rapids, which does have a homeless population already that we're taking care of, how do we fit in these refugees who are coming into to Iowa, and how do we fit them in? And there are great people doing a lot of good work in solving those problems. So
that's a lot of positivity. I'm sure that perhaps you've received some pushback, some people who question what you're trying to do, or the presence of people from other countries in our communities. Let's talk a little bit about some of that you might experience. What are some of the things that you have heard kind of in that realm of that pushback? Or objections from others who are trying to make the United States their home eventually?
The biggest pushback that we've gotten at Family Promise is just are they here legally? And are they doing what they're supposed to be doing? And, unfortunately the response is, I protect their HIPAA, I have to protect their privacy, and just say like, well, you're not on their case, you're not allowed to know, what's going on. But there is a real desire for some reason to think and see an immigrant or someone seeking asylum and think like, well, they're here and they shouldn't be. And you don't know if they've gone through the proper channels. I'm sure there are other things that are said outside of earshot, as this is a really hot topic issue. The only thing that we do is we assure people that we do everything by the board, and we're in touch with the proper agencies. And that the family continues to follow all the rules and meet expectations, just like any other family that we're providing service to. But there obviously is some pushback and some questions, and we just answer them as best we can. And then we got to go out and go about our business and show them, because that's really what is going to convince people, is when they see these families be soccer coaches and have what's going on in this community and the community rallying around them, when they see the refugees in Cedar Rapids assimilate and hang out and go to church and be a part of soccer clubs and things like that. The worries will go away, because that's when you make connections. That's when you realize like, oh, you wanted to be a soccer dad, so am I. And then then all of a sudden you're not like, you're from Congo and I'm from middle of Iowa. Like, you start to make connections, because change is scary, and seeing someone completely different from you that you can't communicate with is often very difficult. And sometimes when we see those things, we shy away from the best versions of ourselves and we become the worst versions.
So one of the most common arguments I hear is that if they came here illegally, and again, more than 50% of them do not, but for some folks, they say even if they overstayed a visa, if they're here on some type of status, which is a civil misdemeanor to be here undocumented, they say, well, there's consequences, right? And they knew there's consequences, and therefore they get what they had coming to them. To which I say, as a pastor, well, thank God Jesus wasn't like that. Because we all have consequences for our choices and the way we live, even if you don't think you're having an affair, or if you're not embezzling, if you're not a thief, if you're not a murderer, those things, the way we live, the fact that there are hungry people going throughout the world, and I've got tons of food in my pantry, and I'm not giving my 2 coats to somebody who doesn't even have one. You know, we're living in this broken place all the time, and deserve judgment, and we don't get it. We get grace, we get mercy. So that's what we choose. And to me, when you talk about the ethical principle, you know, if you go back to Kant, if you really want to get in philosophy, he said the second categorical imperative of the Neo-Kantian deontological theory. Do you remember that from ethics, from your philosophy 101 class? So Kant said his second categorical imperative is do unto others, right? Kant was a very well-versed Bible scholar, and it's basically do unto others. So if this was my family, if I had gone through this and needed the help, I would do it. So we choose to do unto others and say, thank God that we have a community of faith that embodies that, and we seek to be helpers in the time of need, while they have to make hard decisions about what's next for their lives and play by the rules with that catch-22 of they can't leave because they have to stay for that hearing. They don't want to leave, but at the same time they can't work. It's really backwards. So we just choose to be gracious.
I wish we would reframe it under the guise of the real problem would be if all of a sudden a bunch of people were trying to flee the United States.
There was a movie about that, right?
The problem of people wanting to come into our country is, if you could look at it correctly, it's a luxury. It means that we're doing a lot of things right. And the reframe should be, we need to worry when all of a sudden people like us are packing up our bags and going, gotta get to Canada. You know, and if more people thought that way, I think it would go, and we would understand the problem a little better.
That plays into the myth of scarcity, though, that we don't have enough resources. But when you look at how much food we make just for dog food, how many soybeans we put into cat food, things like that, we have more than enough resources to take care of people and jobs.
We're coming to the end of our time, pretty close. So I just have one thing. This is, it's been suggested that this is just going to be part of a process, that more and more of our communities in Iowa and the rural Midwest are going to become ethnically diverse. What is one thing that you would hope for that you think would make that transition a positive and helpful one, and a hopeful one rather than a continued worry about scarcity?
Relationships. Relationships, and streamline the whole process.
Okay. Building relationships. This has been a great conversation. We could probably go on for another hour, I would think. But thank you very much for your time and for your sharing of some stories, so hopefully our hearers can think through some of the relationships that they can build with people from different communities and different cultures in their own spaces. Thank you for joining us, and thank you, the viewers of Ethical Perspectives. This has been our show for today. Have a good day, and we'll see you next time.